You're watching Spoken Wordsmiths, celebrating Philly's poets, a community conversation and showcase presented by WHYY.
Yeah, so I'm just going to jump in and introduce the panel tonight. We are joined again by some diverse voices and some incredibly creative minds in the field of spoken word and poetry writing. First up, it's going to be Eli and Lu Bevins. These are twin sisters, spoken word duo, raised in the Overbrook area. Shouts out to West Philly. Before attending Elizabeth City State University, they received bachelor's in computer science. And just recently, this month, as the 25th, they released an incredible piece of work, really, really genre bending. We'll get into that a little bit later, but it's called Sound Mind Cinematic Mixtape. And so really excited to get into that. Thank you guys for giving your time. Next up, we have Katie Morris. He is a vet in the Philadelphia space of spoken word, performed at Harlem Book Fair. He's been a panelist on the diaspora of poetry. And his connection to the African-American community at the University of Hawaii. This is someone who has been very, very active in the space of spoken word. And next up, we have Cydney Brown. Really excited to speak with her. She is a Philadelphia Youth Poet Laureate and the author of Daydreaming. She is a junior at Addison Friends School and has been writing poetry since she has been in the 5th grade. This is someone who's just charging on to the scene with a lot of quality and a lot of content, and really excited to have her voice be a part of this conversation. And next up, we have King Shice, Reynald Williams. He's someone who I personally have attended the Just Word weekly open mic. This is the longest running open mic ever, 16 years here in the city of Philadelphia. A lot of people came through that building and came through that space and shared their brilliance. And so we can't wait to unpack that and talk about what he has done in the past and what he's doing currently moving forward into the future. And we'll be having a reading from Debra Powell-Wright. This is someone who has been really hard at work in the space of writing for quite some time. And I'll have her kind of give a little bit more about herself as she does her reading. And we'll also have a reading from a Philly artist, Cvgebird. This is another artist that does a lot of genre bending. And he just recently released an incredible video that I couldn't co-sign more. Please go check it out. It's called Free to Trap. And that will be everybody's voice, including, Chris, Norris, and myself. We'll be having this discussion. And first off, we're going to start off with a poetry reading from Cvgebird. Again, thank you all for your voices. Thank you all for your time and really giving to this space and to this conversation. Cvgebird, do you mind doing your poetry reading?
Not at all. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here amongst some of the most amazing voices in the city. So thank you. This piece is dedicated to my father. It's called Conquero. I've always loved the sound of drums. Somewhere between rhythm and movement, my mind locks in tune with the beating of my pulse. And since home is where the heart is, the hardest thing for me to do is convince you that I am here. When I know home is somewhere else, this place is not my own, just a space I seldom leave from, but my imagination cannot stay long. My mind, a creative cave for beats and rhymes to play. I hear the beating of my ancestors' feet, dancing away from this reality I've known to fade. You see, my life is an instrumental that you can never speak on. You can try and break my song, but as long as this Cvgebird sings, my voice will forever live on. Like my father's voice when he speaks in love. I listen to the rhythm that his voice carries and wonder if he realizes that he is an MC, a master creator of his legacy, and he chose me to compose the music for. I rest in the tempo of my temple, listening to the soundscapes of my mental on repeat all day long. You see, my life is an instrumental that you can never speak on. My father was a conguero, and I've always loved the sound of drums. And somewhere between music and movement, I found my roots in the ones I love. Afro Taino, yo soy un bebé de la diaspora. A mixed connection between rhythm and movement, hand and drum, lost identity found in my father's congueros and the song I love. Thank you.
KD, tell me about when did you fall in love with poetry?
Well, I was introduced to poetry when I first heard The Last Poets in 68, 69. Blessed are Those That Struggle was a poem I heard. And then my mother told me what it was. And then I started writing after that. I've been writing ever since.
I fell in love with poetry in 5th grade. We had like a poetry competition in my school and I won and I loved it. And I learned about Maya Angelou and Robert Frost and I just loved it. I just loved it all.
Like it's been around. I can remember grade school here in Gill, The Last Poets, Langston Hughes, but I think it was the message by Grandmaster Flash that made me write my first poem. So it was just there.
I fell in love with poetry, I want to say in high school. I was having like a hard time, and my teacher was just like, you need to get out whatever that you're feeling. Take this journal. And then she the book, I Know Why the Cagebird Sings. And I was in love.
Eli and Lu, when did you guys fall in love with poetry?
It would probably be around the same time, right? Maybe, elementary school, middle school. We weren't like the most outspoken when we were younger. So like anything literature based, from short stories to poems, is sort of where we had our outlet. We're able to be artistic and found our voice there. But yeah, of course, it's going to be the same answer. Same thing for me. Since elementary school, it was how I expressed myself. So, there's a lot of great poets that came before us. Growing up, we didn't have much technology. And so we were always in the books. So,
of course, Debra Powell-Wright, original member of Philly's first female spoken word ensemble. When did you fall in love with poetry?
So for me, the falling in love with poetry was late. I loved reading poetry, but for me to actually fall in love with it was when I went to Temple University's Pan-African Studies Community Education Program. I know Kyle was there as well. And I was in a class with some of the people that are very known in the city of Philadelphia. And I won second place in the Sonia Sanchez Audre Lorde Poetry Writing Contest, which is the first time I met Sonia Sanchez. And as I said, I was a late bloomer to poetry and spoken word, but from there, after I got over the butterflies of seeing and meeting her, I just really, I didn't turn back. So that would have been the time. That was maybe about 20 years ago when I met Sonia.
Yes, Cydney, I'd like to direct this question to you. Do you remember the first poem you wrote? And if so, what was it about?
Yeah, so the first poem I wrote was about, it was a Robert Frost inspired poem because I love the poem Nothing Gold Can Stay. And it was really about changes I was going through in life. So in 5th grade, I was having a really difficulty like keeping friends, and I was the only Black girl in my class. So it was kind of difficult for me to process a lot of things. And I just remember writing about like all the changes I was going through, and people were constantly asking me, "Are you okay, Cydney? Are you okay?" And I just like went to poetry to just really talk about everything I was going with changing friends and just dealing with my mental health at that time.
Awesome. And I'm curious, and I want to direct this question to the entire panel. So we can start with you, Cydney. Where in the city are you from? What community do you have on your back? And has your community or family inspired the things that you write about? Yeah, so I'm from Northeast Philly. I'm like a block away from Northeast High School. And I love my community because it's just, just the people here are great. When I became Youth Poet Laureate of Philadelphia, I got a letter in the mail from everyone in my community saying like, they're so proud of me. So I'm really proud to be from Northeast Philly. And KD, what community banner are you waving wherever you go?
North Philly, every day, all day. And, it was interesting, growing up when I did during the, in the middle of the civil rights movement and everything, and seeing dreadlocks for the first time, not knowing what it meant and asking what it was. And I remember the answer. It was almost the same answer that Malcolm X gave the young woman in London when she asked, what can I do to help? And he said nothing. When I asked the man, why do you have your hair like that? His response was, why do you wear your hair like that? Instead of explaining it. So one of the counselors I was with, and we was on the corner of 13th and Montgomery when I asked him too. So I remember
Beautiful.
So I remember that anything that affects me, I remember. It becomes part of my DNA some way, and then it becomes a part of the poem.
Beautiful, beautiful. And Cvgebird, what neighborhood or block of community?
8th and Oxford.
Okay, nice. And Cvgebird, what community do you have on your back and you carry with you?
I mean, I carry Badlands with me all day. I'm a Badlands.
Oh my gosh. You mute my mic.
To be honest, like when I was young, like my folks moved around a lot because as a kid, so I went from Badlands to South Philly to West Philly. So I represent Philly all day,
Beautiful, beautiful. Eli, Lu, I kind of mentioned it earlier, but by all means, talk about your community and have they inspired you to write anything?
Yes, we're from West Philly, Overbrook section, Overbrook High, very creative community out west. But we like to say we were raised by the village. We were raised by our grandparents. So the village, which is our community, definitely helped in a lot. The arts had a lot of influence on, us coming up. So shout out to West Philly.
Beautiful, beautiful. And Deborah, I would love to hear about your community, your upbringing, and if that inspired you to write anything.
I was raised in Germantown, and I think Germantown is a very eclectic kind of community and neighborhood. So I was always has been a watcher. So I'm kind of the person that lays back and watches and looks and listens and always a reader. And so all of it, everything. And as the twin said, like the whole village was really my community, but that's where I was raised. Yes.
It definitely is North Philly. That's one of my monikers, North Philly's finest. And I definitely carry it on my back, but it's the whole Philly because I travel. So when I'm traveling, it's just Philly. But when I'm in Philly, then how we do with the neighborhoods, we start South Philly, Germantown. My mother and father's from Germantown. It's funny though, when the sister Cydney Brown said her community got behind her, it was the opposite for me and my guys. They was clowning. They was clowning, Shice doing poetry. But the first time I did a radio interview and did poetry on WHYY, I got somebody to tape it and I let them hear it. Then they was like, oh, we get it. Because they knew me. And when they heard my poetry, it wasn't what they probably thought poetry was supposed to sound like. So when they heard me, it's like, okay, that's North Philly.
When I was growing up, I went to Barrett, then I went to Brook for 2 years and then graduated from uni. Poetry has always been positioned as a very emotional kind of art form where you're kind of expressing your feelings through rhythm and words and cadence. And unfortunately, it can also be pigeonholed as a not so masculine act, right? I mean, as you were saying, your boys was clowning you. What's your advice? What do you say to young boys who want to do poetry, who may be watching this now and be inspired, who think, I want to do that, but this ain't really my thing. This ain't masculine enough. They have this warped sense of manhood.
It wasn't the masculinity thing that was being challenged. And I don't really get the masculinity thing being challenged. It was the nerdy thing being challenged. Like it's corny to do it, or it's kind of nerdy, intellectual, nerdy thing. So that's what it is. And for me, if I'm talking to any young brother, because I like to do youth events, so once they hear me, it's the same it was for me. It's hearing Saul Williams and Ursula Rucker and loving them and all the different. I was like, do I have a voice in that? Until I heard somebody else, and I was like, oh, I can be my authentic self. So when I go to young people, it's to give them something else that they probably didn't expect to hear. I didn't went to places that get real unsettled and say, we got a poet today. and then I say something real slick to them, and then and then when I go in, it was like, okay, I get it now.
KD, just kind of same question for you, man. I feel like rap and poetry has so many synergies and overlapping, but young brothers they won't think twice about getting engaged in rap or wanting to be a rapper, but poetry has a certain type of context to it. Can you speak a little bit to the synergies between rap and poetry, and what would you say to a young brother who wants to get engaged in poetry but may not feel like it's the cool thing to do?
Well, when I was touring around the country, going into different schools and encountering these young men, even in the justice system, those who were incarcerated, the conversation was always starting off like, who's your favorite rapper? And find out where their head is and what they like to listen to, how they communicate.
I do the same.
And then take them from where they are, meet them where they are, and then get them to write and express where they are in their life. And once they get used to writing it, then the challenge is getting them to recite it, to share it. And once they see that's okay to share, then, it becomes like easy for them. So you just got to get them to find the difference between that cadence of the delivery and the style, and learn that there's different delivery styles for one poem. And, the tools that we use, the devices and all that stuff. Once they get the tools and the courage per se, they'll learn that it's not about being masculine or feminine, it's about being creative and being heard.
Thank you for that. Amir, turn it back over to you, but I have to ask, you're the Bul Bey, you rap. Do you also consider yourself a poet? And do you find a lot of synergies overlapping between rap and poetry?
Well, the answer, I guess the latter part of the question, there's incredible overlap. I think about Amir Baraka, just kind of like speaking over instruments. That's just like a clear indication of MC, controlling space. And it's not what we think about as rapping, but it's absolutely rapping. What I consider myself a spoken word artist. To be honest, I hold spoken word performers in such a high regard. I'm like, man, there's actual focus and craftsmanship in that. And so I want to be very careful about that, calling myself that, but I absolutely am a rapper. I absolutely am an MC. Spoken word art, poetry writing are art forms that are just incredible. But I was gonna say
shout out to Cvgebird. She just put the first time I've ever seen that rap is rhythm and poetry.
Yeah, I use that a lot. I work with incarcerated youth. I've been an incarcerated youth advocate for like a few years now, and that's one thing. You're going as a poet or as an artist is breaking that barrier down. You know what I mean? And kind of like what KD was saying, meeting the kids where they're at, teaching them that, like, poetry is dope. It's just, rap is just rhythm and poetry. So the better you can.
100%. And I want to bring it back to KD. Who were some of the poets that you read, listened to, and were inspired by? I guess, you mentioned the last poets, but are there any other poets that you could throw out there? And are they from Philadelphia?
Well, yeah. Well, let's see. Well, you got Marvin X, Watts Prophets, Nikki Giovanni, Gil Scott Heron, Ed Shockley. Those are Kamika Williams, Lois Moses. And I also gotta mention the people who I also worked with directly on hands-on, and two of which are on this panel, Deb and Shice. Because because we come through different levels at different times, but we all ended up in the same space on the same stages sometimes for the same reasons. And now we're all here for the same purpose. So anybody who went to Just Words or came to my venue, Fire and Ice at Warm Daddies, and the Company of Poets with Deb, and all the other living room venues, that we all had, corners, porches, outside the venue, those are the poets that I looked up to, read, and learned from, as well as had a fair exchange of wisdom and information.
That's really interesting. Could you reflect a little bit more on that community building process? Because you mentioned living rooms and corners and different things like that. Like, what are those, what's the science of building a community with spoken word artists?
during the time that I was touring and everything, living rooms were also the venues and also the place for workshops where we practiced and ran, rehearsed our new poems and argued over, what we felt, was good until one of my mentors tore up one of, my partner's poem. And literally tore it to shreds and said, start over. And we was like, wow. But the thing about the challenges is if you don't have anyone in your community to challenge you, you never know what you're doing right. Or no, you never know what you're doing wrong. Because everybody thinks what we do is great. But then we forget there's a barometer. There's someone who came before us and we have to ascribe to be as good, if not better than, without being competitive against those who came before us. Because you got to.
Is that a regular practice? Like tearing up?
Well, it should be. It should be. Now, but see, it's also a learned behavior because respect is given where it is due.
A couple of things to what KD said in terms of community, because one of the things that happened for us becoming in the company of poets as a poetry ensemble of women, before that, we were a poetry circle. And in fact, we went to each other's houses and KD was one of them. And so, so it was men and women, gathered together, as he said, and the lingo is called the art of literary criticism. And so we would be able to do that because we had the tools to do that because we sat with people who knew more than us. And then for us, particularly in the company of poets as the ensemble, it really was just because the sisters were going out to the clubs together. And one day we were, in fact, at Community College of Philadelphia, and someone said, "Are you a group?" And we looked at each other and we said, yes. So that's how the ensemble itself was formed. By Pat McLean Smith. Shout out to her. She's like my right and my left in terms of poetry. But I just wanted to speak to that in terms of community. Like KD said, we went to each other's homes. We were in these free workshops. And then I also want to share about the critique. I was in the New Black Voices poetry writing workshop. That was my first workshop that I had ever attended. I had dabbled a little bit in writing. And so my first poem that I wrote in the workshop, now let me say, New Black Voices. So I wrote this poem and one of the words, and I'll just say one of the words in it was Confucius. And Confucius is an Asian philosopher. And so Dr. Regina Jennings, who is a former Black Panther, who was taught by Sonia Sanchez, said, "Oh no, you didn't come in here with, you're gonna have to find a Black philosopher or you're gonna have to find another way because you are in New Black Voices. That's not gonna cut it." So, again, to KD's point, we have to be able to critique each other, lovingly, but we have to be able to do that because that is how we grow and get better.
Thank you for that, Deborah. I had a question to follow up with that for Cydney, the twins, and Cvgebird, starting with the twins. It's, in your generations, how did you guys build community? I mean, is it a similar story to what you heard in terms of building, doubling living rooms as venues, or were there other places in the city that really inspired you that you went to? I mean, KD and I were talking about the 5 Spot before we went live, and that was a place that had a really impact on our music life. What was it like for you guys?
Well, there was a lot of, I guess, low-key spots, to be honest, where poets would kind of hang out around the city. And honestly, it can be in the most broken places, and you would show up and like, oh, the event is taking place here. And then when you got inside, the vibe and the energy is because, the various poets in the city would just come together and speak their truth. And I think that was the first time before we actually started performing where I was like, there's a whole nother world in Philly where people are touching and changing lives where people are, whether, it's an abandoned building or old falling apart property. And even traveling up to New York, sometimes it was the same vibe. But I think with what we experience is the experience, where people come to learn something from somebody else. One of the things I was going to talk about also was that being in spaces where people aren't a fan of spoken word or poetry is also a thing. Is this negative, I guess, title that kind of hangs over, spoken word. We would run into people and say, people still do poetry or spoken word. And that's something I heard in the 80s. And so I think for us, it's just more so revamping it or introducing it to the next generation. Otherwise, preserving that art. Otherwise, those things can fade. So I think, I don't know if you wanted to add to that, but yeah, I think it's definitely growing, and Philadelphia has a strong community. Yeah.
Thank you for that. In just a second, Debra Powell-Wright will give us a reading. I'm looking forward to that. But Cydney and then Cvgebird, what were the places in your life, your generation, that helped you build community? How did it materialize?
Yeah, I can go. So I never really had that like poetry community. Really, I think it was kind of like just mostly my family. My sister went to Kappa, did creative writing. My older sister kind of liked writing too. My mom, my dad, they write. So it's kind of just like having them, and like to touch on the piece that Katie and Deborah are talking about, criticism. Like my mom, my sister are my biggest critics, and if I have something that's not good, they will tell me. So that's been really helpful for me because if you ask a friend or something, they'll be like, "Oh, it's great. You always write something great," but that's not really helpful, and you don't want to hear that. So it's really just been my family. It's helped me, and like with the help of Deborah, like bringing me into different spaces with poets that have been around has really been helpful for me to like get into that scene and really be inspired and learn from older poets.
I appreciate that. Thank you for that. I mean, I think if you don't have at least one person in your life that tells you the truth, you got to make some new friends. Cvgebird, what was it like for you growing up? What were some of the venues or spaces in the city that helped you build community?
Yeah, so similar to like what folks talked about, I think there was always pockets, right, of poets. And like I said, I went to Kappa High School as well, and I found poetry in the classroom. But the first time I ever like found a space was two things. Shiest, he hosts the poetry event at Downlands Palace, and I remember being like 17, trying to get into the mix, and it was the first time I actually been around poets, and it literally felt like a whole other world. Like I never knew, especially like growing up where I came from, we didn't have them type of spaces. We would maybe be on outside somebody's house or on a block ciphering or spitting or doing stuff like that, but to find a space of poetry where like people are bearing their truths in a beautiful way and getting called in, that was the first time I ever even knew that you could do that as a poet. And being around Shice, being around different artists like Lyrispec, Ms. Rock, Alicia Wise, different artists that all came through that space. It was the first stage I ever even performed on. And there was like 3 people there, but by the end of the night, because if you sign a list late, you don't get on.
So true.
It was so empowering, and it really helped me find my voice. Even before I started singing and led into MCing, we would get out of Dallas Palace, then we'd be like, all right, let's go kick it at so and so's house, and we would just cipher poetry, and it was beautiful. It really, I feel like poetry and art and music saved me from myself.
100%.
Tristan.
I love.
Oh, I'm sorry. Shice, you were going to say something?
Yes, to the sisters that spoke about bringing it to a new demographic, that's going to always keep happening. I'm 2004. I've been doing this since 2004. And Katie would tell you, even though I hosted a weekly event, I was in venues 3, 4, 5 nights a week up and down East Coast, Philly, all the time. And every time I hit the stage, I was new to somebody. I've done venues with 3 people at Najee's Loft or 300 people at the Clef Club. Right. And I made a concerted effort to go outside of the poetry spots. So I opened up for fashion shows, comics, be the only poet in a room full of rappers, the only poet at a R&B showcase with live music. And I'm always a new to somebody. Right. You're always gonna be new. It's the gift and the curse. With 1.6 million people, I think that's the last census we got in Philadelphia, just to get people in a room, you still always, I can walk down the street and somebody, you can know me from poetry, and I can walk past 30 people that never see me before in their life. Know me and never knew I do poetry. It's just a rinse and repeat. So I say the gift and the curse. Every time you go out, you're new to somebody, so you get that new feeling. It doesn't get stagnant to you. And if you got a book in your hand or whatever you putting your work on, you're meeting new people that can become new fans or new supporters.
Right. That's love. The thing about what Shai said is, and it happens to us, especially when we engage the youth, is there's going to be those kids or someone from the past that come up to you, not because you're a poet, but because you made a difference in their life.
And by the way, I want to share, I'm reading from a collection called Stand Our Ground by Urare Asuande. And in this collection, there's people like Amir Baraka, of course, Sonia Sanchez, too many people to name, but not just from Philly, but people whose names that we do know and should know. And so I'm really honored to be in this collection. This poem that I'm going to read is called Southwest Township. In the dry white season of Soweto, soldiers and civilians shared bartered beer and bullets, while Steve Biko's Black consciousness languished between Sarafina lives and South African language liberation songs. Didn't take long for the common hood to be silenced and unpacified babies to morph into misunderstood youth. Their missed education became the norm. So why ask how did the righteous get wronged? Why ask how did the righteous get wronged? Why ask how did the righteous get wronged? In the moist red June of 76, Hector's 13-year-old history, housed in one photographic memory, reminded mourners of red, black, and green grief. Southwest segregation paved the way for shantytown demoralization, while our young warriors cried freedom on already tear-stained roads. Their multicolored blood can't distinguish friend from foe. Do you know what's happening in your Soweto? Do you know what's happening in your Soweto? Do you know what's happening in your Soweto? Because in the dark, shady aftermath of apartheid, polling still ain't easy for elders trying to vote with the rights they won. And gold rush ghettos thrive in the name of truth and reconciliation. New spoken words can't be heard. Politicians don't always keep their word. Another revolutionary child has lost her life. Another revolutionary child has lost his life. Another revolutionary child has lost their life. Armed forces, unable to fight poverty and strife. There's no place for poor people to find peace on earth when our activists and ancestors are exiled from their place of birth. Do you care what's happening in your Soweto? Do you care what's happening in your Soweto? Do you care what's happening in the dry white season of the ghetto? Thank you.
Jumping back into the conversation, I want to spotlight Cydney Brown. You are the Philadelphia Youth Poet Laureate. What does it take to become a Youth Poet Laureate? I want to know that process and your experience around that.
Yeah, so basically I stumbled across the Free Library of Philadelphia's page during the summer of 2020. And I was looking at like a bunch of different things I could apply for, just creative things. And I found the application to become Youth Poet Laureate at Philadelphia. And basically you put in some like writing supplements, you add like a video of you performing a poem, civic engagement, community service, things that you've done. And then after they review that, then you'll go through another process. And if you become a finalist, then you'll get to an interview. And I was interviewed by Yolanda Wisher and Tripita B. Mason. And then I became the Youth Poet Laureate of Philadelphia.
It's very cool.
Yeah, for sure. I'm gonna
how did you just
go ahead.
A quick question, just quick follow-up, Cydney. How did your classmates respond to that? And did it take how much explaining did you have to explain to them in terms of what that is?
Yeah, no, definitely at first. It was like, what even is that? Like, what are you doing? And I would just send them a link. I would be like, read. I'm not just gonna say it every time, but it was great. I hearing like everyone just support me and be like, I know you've loved poetry for such a long time, so I'm glad that you have this title and you're able to do things in your community. But yeah.
Thank you for that. Amir?
Earlier in the opening of this program, I mentioned that April is National Poetry Month. April 25th, Eli and Lu released a format and genre bending product called Sound of Mind Cinematic Mixtape. I wanted to ask the twins, what was the motivation behind that, and what pushed you to start bending format and
Right. So it's funny because when we talk about spoken word, what we always tend to do is to blend the different arts with spoken word, and usually we'll come to our team meetings and we'll have an idea, and so they're always behind us and supportive. But when we got tired of being put in a box, basically, and so with Sound Mind, it's actually a spoken word cinematic mixtape. We're filmmakers, so why not create a film and why not use spoken word? The thing we love about spoken word is that you can say a lot in a short amount of time and get your point across. And it's also artistic and creative. And so Sound Mind is a thought-provoking project. Everything we do is thought-provoking. There's a lot of content out here that we feel like, people are talking about a lot of stuff, but a lot of stuff that people aren't talking about. Yeah. So we try to target those issues in a very creative way without being preachy in your face. But at the end of the day, you get a message from it.
Right. And Sound Mind is 12 short films that correspond with 12 spoken word hip hop tracks. So we kind of fused, we have dance, poetry, hip hop, film. And we do that a lot with our work. In 2018, we did a spoken word stage play where everything was in spoken word. Right. We were blessed enough to get 700 people to attend, but it was a challenge because thank you. People were like, what in the world is a spoken word stage play? So I go back to, Shaish, you were talking about introducing spoken word to a new group of people. We do it in film, we do it in stage play, we do it in different genres. So just constantly fusing the arts, we're able to bring in new audiences. We've had people say, I'm not coming to that, or I'm not listening to that because,
friends, family, people.
I don't really care.
The
for
biggest
poetry.
supporters was like, I don't care for poetry.
But after they listen or they come out, we released our cinematic mixtape, which we're constantly like, what in the world is that? But it's called Sound Mind. It's out now. But we're able to, if you don't like the poetry, all right, you will probably like the film. Maybe you'll like the film. Maybe you'll like the dance. Maybe you'll like hip hop. I love the conversation earlier about, hip hop and poetry, because it's always ironic to me how people are like, yeah, I love Tupac and I love, or DMX, and I'm like, they all started in poetry, they're all poets at the end of the day. So it's amazing when I hear people kind of, right. So what we tend to do are a lot of our poems we can actually do with a beat behind it. So then it's like rap hip hop. And then if we strip it away, then it's a poem. So we kind of go back and forth. Sometimes people ask us to perform. I'm like, you want the poem side or you want the hip hop side?
So that we can reach different people with the same art. Yeah.
I was just going to speak to or ask the twins whether or not have they seen this format style in other places. I'm always looking for a moment to say that's Philly. That's something that came out of Philadelphia. Did you see this other places? Did you get inspiration, or you're like, no, this is something that we kind of like, birthed?
It was for us when we started. Honestly, it's so funny because we didn't know what to call it at first. We were like spoken word stage play. Like, how do we get people to understand that the entire stage play is in spoken word? We had, Teresa the Songbird. I don't know if you guys are familiar with her, but she played our mother in the play. We had a gentleman from New Jersey and, another fellow artist from Philly. And we brought everyone together and told the entire story. And it was about family. So we've never seen it done before. So the marketing was really interesting. And we had people come up to us after we ran into a lady in a parking lot on City Ave. And she was like, I was there. And I believe she was in her late 40s. And her daughter was also like 6 or 7. She said, I loved it. And I typically don't like poetry. And my daughter who's 6 loved it. So then we were like, wow, is this something that, no matter the age, is something people can relate to. Right. But the format we've never seen before. And we just were like, forget what it actually is.
Yeah, and we spent a lot of time thinking about what it is for almost a year. And one of our mentors in LA said, stop thinking about what it is and just do it, and people would take to it. So
I love that.
using spoken word in so many. In fact, our first film award ever was actually a spoken word film. And we didn't win because of our quality, that's for sure at the time. Our quality sucked. We didn't have the funds to make a high quality film, but I think it was the message of spoken word and talking about the poverty that we saw in Philadelphia in such a powerful way.
I love that. Chris?
Yes, just to piggyback off of that, Selina and I also was in a group together called Poetry in Motion.
Yeah.
We didn't do a play, but we turned our poems to skits. So if you came to one of our shows, we might have like 8 skits from the poetry. And it's the same thing. You know, you could get those people to come to a Poetry in Motion show, but can't get them to go to a poetry show.
Right.
People always have this stigma in their head, and it kills me. Like I think they feel like it's a compliment. They say, I don't like poets, but I like you.
Right.
You know, tell people, just like when KD said, what rapper do you like? And we can start there. Because if you told me what you like, you can't tell me if you're into, you know, I can put you in a love poet, a relationship poet, a erotic poet, a funny poet, a social commentary poet, Teresa the Songbird poet. Like it's like telling me you don't like music. Right. You might not like R&B, but you like rock and roll. You might like rap, but you like soul music, or you like gospel. Tell me where you at, and I can find your poet that you'll say, I don't like poetry, but I like you.
Right, right. We also started a virtual through the pandemic. We started a virtual talent show, which was grounded in we call it poetic experience because there's poetry in everything. We co-executive produced with veteran actor Richard Lawson and Tina Knowles Lawson in LA. So it's a Philly and LA show, and we did it virtually. But it's a global show. We had people from Ghana, from the UK, from India, all doing poetry, but every form of it was different. Some of it was more hip hop. Some of it, you know, was like reading poetry, but we called everybody wordsmiths, and we looked at different genres of wordsmiths, from comedy, monologues, you know, everything has poetry in it. So it's helping people understand that any form of words or verbal art is in fact poetry.
Beautiful.
Thank
Chris,
you.
did you want to get back to your, yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up with the twins, but then also direct this question to Cvgebird and KD. How much of, and actually for we can go, because we're getting up on the Q&A section, so we can go around the bin and give everybody a chance to answer this. But how much of what you write and produce is meant to inspire people to take action, and this may sound cheesy, but change the world or change their neighborhood?
For us, about 100% of our writing, because that was the birth of it. Growing up in Philly, if we're just being transparent for a second, I was one of those kids that there was a lot, again, being raised by our grandparents. Our grandfather, he passed when we were 14 from lung cancer. So I built everything up inside. I was the type that our English professor was like, can y'all stay after class? And he said, your poetry is beautiful, but why is it so dark? And for me, it was never that it was dark because I'm such a goofy, happy person. But the only way I could express pain was through the pen and paper. It was the most interesting thing. So now that I'm older, I'm kind of using that as a platform for other people. We're in a pandemic right now, and if people got a lot of stress, they want to get out. The youth need an outlet. Poetry can be one of those things, whether it's rap, songwriting. They all kind of fuse together. But yeah, for me, I would say I have to be 100%.
Yeah, we're all about thought provoking and consciousness, regardless of the medium, whether it's a stage play, a film, just poetry on stage. So everything we do is to help someone in some way, shape, or form.
Nice.
Thank you for that. Also, I'd be remiss not to give a shout out to a buddy of mine, Greg Corbin, Philadelphia Youth Poetry Movement, Kaya Davis. Those guys were some of the first poets I had the chance to really experience. Cvgebird, what about you? How much of what you do is about getting people to take action, to be thought provoking?
I'd say same with the twins, about 100%. Like when I first fell in love with poetry, similarly, it was a way to get out all the things that were built up inside, and I didn't have an outlet for that. And then once I found that tool, it was like I want to put everybody onto this tool. And not only that, like, I think it was Nina Simone that said it best: if you're an artist and not reflective of the times that you're living in, then what is your art doing, and what is it for? And that just always resonated with me, and especially as like a mixed like kid of the diaspora, like I feel like it's my job, to uplift my community, uplift Black and Brown community, uplift ourselves into freedom, and to continue this fight. Even with the project I just put out, Free to Trap, Similarly, like that whole song is literally about revolutionary joy and claiming our joy and our right to be unapologetically ourselves. And I think that it's important as we get older to pass that down to the youth and to the young ones, and also give them that outlet as well, to be able to find their voice and know that their voice can change the world. Because if someone else doesn't feel like they can say it, when they hear you, you might inspire someone else to tell their story and continue to build community globally and worldwide. So definitely 100% of everything I do, from poetry to music, to working with my youth, you know what I mean? Like, it's for all of us to get free.
KD, same question for you. How much of what you do is about changing hearts and minds and reflecting, society?
Well, I heard someone else mention it. My mom used to always say, "Why is your writing so serious?" And this and that and other. But you got to remember who I first heard, the last poets. And coming up in the civil rights movement in that era, and being on Columbia Avenue doing the riot with my aunt. So everything I write, even now, even in my love poems, there's a message. There's some didactic reason there where it's going to teach you something. And your poem should generate dialogue anyway. You just don't want people to clap and be entertained. It's like they walk out of a movie theater and they only talk about the parts they like. But then another movie comes and that movie is no longer talked about. So the things our obligation to society as poets is to inform, enlighten, enrage, and inspire. So if all of us here right now, I'm quite sure we have something in our repertoire that sparks something in someone, even to make them want to write a poem and call themselves poet.
Thank you for that. Deborah, same question.
Yeah, I mean, I like that is the answer. I think that you would not call yourself a poet unless you care about people. The language that we didn't have back in the day, and I'll speak to that in terms of the pandemic, what we have now is the language of self-care. Like, we're able to talk about self-care now. So in 2020, poetry was my self-care, so it's not just about the isolation, but many of us suffered losses before, during, and after, this thing is over. And so for me personally, the poetry in this time really helped me help myself. And in doing so, I was able to expand that to help other people.
Thank you for that. Shice?
It's a process. The beginning, I just wanted to be heard. Like, I was writing for so long. I entered the spoken word in my early 30s. So you got to figure, from grade school to 30, I was just stuffing writings in the drawers and putting them in poem books and writing short stories, essays. And when I finally got it out, it was just to be heard. And then I started watching how people responded. But like KD knows, the environment of Just Words was, they're drinking, there's live music, we got comics in there, we got rappers and singers. So it just came off as entertainment. And I got kind of jaded or discouraged into somebody came and put me into a youth event. Like, I went all the way to Atlantic City. That was my first youth event, and to talk to a Boys and Girls Club and to see the difference.
Last but not least, Cydney Brown. How much of what you write and think about is meant to change hearts and minds, to reflect society, to be, relevant to the moment?
Yeah, I would say a lot of it. And I'm usually sharing my spoken word on Instagram and things like that, and trying to get people to, change their hearts and minds and really start a conversation. In my book, self-published book, Daydreaming, I really touched on just a lot of different things that I've dealt through my whole life. And I think just by sharing your experiences, you're really just inspiring others to speak their truth. And I love just going into different schools in Philly and just talking to them about how important it is to share your truth, because then other people can feel more vulnerable and willing to talk about things. Because if you don't talk about those things, then everyone's kind of just in the dark and alone. So if we just make that community and make sure that everyone knows it's okay to be vulnerable and talk about what you're going through, then more youth can feel inspired to make change.
Thank you for that. And thank you all for those really enlightening answers. And thank you all for the amazing and important work that you're doing and the contributions to the world of poetry. Amir?
What piece of poetry that you've written that you're most proud of? And what's the story behind that piece? And again, we'll start with you, Ms. Debra Powell-Wright, and move around and then move to the Q&A.
I would have to say, actually, the poem that I'm most proud of is the one that I first wrote, and that was before I went to the class, and the poem is called On Being. And that poem is really about, I became a mother at age 18, single mother. And so it was, the poem was really, I woke up with it and just thinking about the challenges that I was facing. I probably wrote it when my daughter was maybe about 5 or 6. I'm not remembering now, but just remembering being afraid of going through the process of birthing a child at a young age. And so that poem is actually dedicated to her and, questioning, but appreciating at this. So doing both, questioning, how did I get here? And saying in the end, that she will be someone that I want to know. And of course she is, at the age that she is, a grown woman whose birthday was Monday. Yes.
Happy belated birthday to her, of course. And Mr. Scheist, I want to know about, a poem that you've written that means the most to you and a little bit of a backstory.
That's a tough one. Somebody that put out 12 CDs of spoken word. But I would have to say, and Katie knows this piece, Niggas the Gods. Now the backstory is, I seen the book in a magazine. The back of the magazine they had books. When I seen that title, it just resonated. Like, what does that mean? What does that mean? It just sounded real profound. Then I read the book, and it just all made sense. I read a bunch of books, but this one, the title and what he was saying, I was at a crossroad. Do I want to use the N word anymore, or do I want to do this? I get it, how we flipped it, and I understand the history of it. So the backstory was that book convinced me to not use it as far as addressing my brothers and sisters. Now I might use it in the poem to make a point. So the backstory to that was, it's about recognizing the God in you and where you come from, and to get out that mentality state. So it meant the most to me because it's almost always, I close the set out with it. It's one of my earliest poems, and one I no matter how many other poems I write, if I'm going to a school at-risk program, I got to get it in there. So it just means a lot to me. It's the connection. Like when I heard the last poet say, niggas are scared of revolution, and listening to all those Farrakhan speeches, it comes together in that poem, Niggas the God, and the book. So the background story, and I did this in a prison, and the inmates gave me a standing ovation. So it means that much to me. It's a poem that it resonates a lot to my brothers that might be still in the streets or still with that mentality. When I say it to them, it almost like turns a light switch on for them the way it did for me.
Beautiful. I love that. Cydney Brown, could you tell us about a piece of poetry that you've written that you're most proud of in the backstory?
Yeah, so I would say a poem that I'm really proud of is one entitled Round Trip. I wrote that in 2020, and it means a lot to me because I was able to, I feel like, inspire a lot of people with it. And I think I just love when I'm able to go into schools or talk to older people, and they kind of get what I'm saying, and just that was something that any space I'm in and they ask me to read a poem, I kind of go with that one. And when I'm really hesitant sometimes to say it, because I don't know, sometimes I'll be reading in front of just a room full of white women, so it's kind of I'm literally saying white supremacy and white privilege and all of this jazz. I don't know what they're gonna think, but they always give me a standing ovation. They always love it. So I just think the power of words and being able to go into different spaces and share one piece and they all kind of react the same is kind of nice. And I really like that I'm able to do that. But that poem kind of touches on unity and really just all everyone coming together and realizing that we all have to fight white supremacy, because if we don't, then we're all just kind of dealing with our own battles and nothing's really going to come out of that.
Indeed.
Wonderful, wonderful. Cvgebird, could you answer the same question?
Yeah. Well, when it comes to mine, I think the first poem I ever performed is probably the one that's most meaningful for me, because it kind of is what engaged me and kind of allowed me to be in the community. And Shice, you might remember this one, but it was called Subway Carts. And kind of like what Deb was saying, just being young and kind of being an observer. I would always ride the subway, especially like going to school or going wherever. And I would go from one part of the city all the way down to the other part of the city, so you could see like who comes on, who doesn't, and between that, and especially between I think like Black and brown folks. And when I rode subway carts, it was kind of making the connection of like, dang, here we go, are on the underground carts, and it's like the underground march. And how do we come together to kind of fight a common enemy, and that common enemy being white supremacy, and the way that we're all put beneath that due to the way that, you know, colonization affected so many people. And you know, it's dope today. I think it's amazing that there's a lot more you know, back in the day, there wasn't any talk about like Afro-Latinos, even though we know Afro-Latinos exist, right? There wasn't any talk about just indigenous Latinx folks, even though we know they exist. And it was always this whitewashed version of what Latinx looks like. And I think I don't know, I think the poem was kind of like before its time, so to speak. And to see like those conversations shifting and the connections happening, like I'm grateful, you know what I mean, to have put that out into the world at such a young age. You know, being a child of my father, he's Afro-Latinx, my mother, who's indigenous Latinx, and living with those identities within my body, it's complex, right? So I'm grateful to have put that poem out there and kind of saw that at a young age, and to kind of see the conversation happening now. And that's probably one of my favorite pieces. And also the most recent piece I wrote, which is in the Free to Trap music video, just talking about like, you know, what is a body but a cage for the spirit? You know, we are God body. This body can only serve me for so long, but I will never let it change my spirit. This body may go into the ground, but my spirit will transcend and become another version of that, right? So even when the body is gone, your soul lives forever. So those are the two.
Yeah, let them see the video. Don't give it all to them. Yeah, but Eli and Lu, could you come on, and then KD, could you finish off? What was a piece of poetry that you've written that you're most proud of in the backstory?
I guess I'll start. I just want, for me, it's going to be the Broken Table stage play. I know I'm kind of saying the whole stage play, but we kind of wrote a lot of the pieces together with with the various poets. But I picked that because Broken Tables, the stage play, essentially just means broken families. Again, we were raised by grandparents. There was 9 of them, and so growing up, we had big dinners on outside of like just holidays. And there's only about 3 left, but as the years went on, that all faded, and the dining room table became where you put your mail and your keys. And so my younger cousins who are like 19 and 20 now, they're like, oh, the dining room table, we eat in our room. I've never ate at the dining room table. And then it hit us that, oh my gosh, there's a lot of people that don't never even experience sitting at the dining room table with family and literally just eating. We're in our phones, we're doing this. And so the other thing is bringing everything to the table, which we don't do. You know, we have pain. I know people who are like 60, 70 years old that still have pain that they're holding on to from other family members. And so Broken Tables, when we did the play, I don't think we was expecting the impact that it would have on people, especially the men and fathers, because we have a scene, not giving anything away, but we had a scene that touched on that. And so the mail that we got after about, hey, I'm trying to find my son that I've never met. Hey, we haven't had a family reunion in 10 to 20 years, but because of your play, we're going to start one. And so for me, I think also pulling from experience, that would always be a poem or a piece that we've written, that by the end, everybody said, that's my story. And we said, how could we all say this is our story when none of us are related? We're from different, places. But I think it's because a lot of people can relate to just family hurt in general. and that pain that we hold on to. So for me, Broken Tables, the stage play, but the various pieces we wrote for to represent the various family members. So I have a different answer, but to tap into her answer, we had a poem together called "What Are You Serving Your Family?" The same thing people say, you are what you eat, but what you put into your family is the same thing. So that was something just a tag team. But I'm going to give you guys a different answer than a twin answer. I'm going to go with a poem that we have called "The Epidemic That Killed Kings and Queens." In short, it's pretty much, a focus on the drug epidemic in the 80s that changed, the Black community. We look at now at some of the violence and the things that's happening with our youth. And the question we ask in that poem is, how did we get here? And we kind of go back through time of how the drug epidemic pretty much plagued our communities. It's also on our Sound Mind mixtape. If I dropped the link in the chat, so there's a visual that goes with it, but we take the standpoint of, most times you see a film, it's literally in the 80s and people are on drugs. But if you check ours out, we filmed it at the Belmont Mansion. And we take it from the standpoint of actual kings and queens, which we are, but we show it visually. So if anybody wants to check it out, but we show it through the eyes of a child. And just, we grew up in the 90s, but we were pretty much, coming out of the drug epidemic. So we kind of had to deal with the aftermath. So that's pretty much what that piece is about.
100%. I love that. And KD.
Yeah, I was sitting here thinking, and I had to dig deep, and it's the poem that I've never recited. But if it's called "When I Was 6 Years Old," and the reason why is because it was therapeutic for me. I wrote it in 2004, and it was after a conversation that sparked a memory inside me which reminded me when I was 6 years old and I was molested by my babysitter and her brother. And I wrote the poem, and it was just for me. And that's the poem that kept me. But it also, through the poem, I found out who I was and why. Because I found out why I'm impartial to strangers, why I have such a big protective nature about myself. And I'm very protective of people I'm close with. I'm protective of strangers. That's just who I am. And I realized it was from that poem. From that experience, and I realized it through the release it through that poem. Now, the poems that I recite is one poem that I'm still reciting. And my son is 30 now. The poem is about 25 years old, From a Shallow Grave.
Yo, that's mine.
Yeah, so that's the one that I recited. That's my favorite, because everywhere I go, if I do it, it hits.
I personally want to say thank you all to all of you for your time, again, your flexibility, your voice, your insight. We are hitting the end of this event. Thank you for everybody for being lively in the chat and dropping some questions. Again, this isn't a conversation that ends here. We can keep this going beyond this platform. I'll be, working with a lot of the panelists and urging them to continue to lend their voices in reflection pieces as well. My name is Amir Richardson, aka the Bul Bey. I'm a local hip hop artist. I'm a WHYY community curator. I encourage our viewers to become WHYY members by going to whyy.org/TV12. Pledge any amount and it makes you a member. And we're going to, again, I'm going to express my personal thank you to everyone here. Thank you so much for your time, your insight, flexibility, all of it, your patience, most of all. And we're going to finish this event with a video from twins performing a piece. Thank you so much again for your contributions. Everyone have a good evening. Be safe and take care of each other.
We're too blind to see the truth, even when it hits us in the face. So blind that we see color, we're still arguing race with race. But when America showed its true color of red, a land once filled with nothing but bloodshed, when heavy whips penetrated the flesh of slaves, and racism separated our worlds back in those days. When the irony of our national anthem brought this great country to shame, there were many who stood up for a change, even when the storm came. So if I'm wrong for calling on a revolution, then I'll take the blame. Let the judge call me guilty, let it replace my name, because I get tired of waking up to gunshots in the middle of the night, sounding like an alarm clock waking me up to life. But this just can't be right. Too many people pulling triggers before they stop to think. Too many kids dying young before they get a chance to blink. We pledge our allegiance to a United States, but a divided people. Yes, you can do everything I can, but wait. You will never be equal. Dr. King tried to kill the sequel, but they rather kill Dr. King. What a nightmare, but I promise you we can still dream, even when it seems that some people just don't give a.
Damaged are our minds. Rewind to Columbine. Killing sprees. Kind mothers on their knees. The land of the free. Is it really ideally? Oh, home sweet America. Voices of society often come to bother me. Speaking nothing but words of hatred. The American dream. Nothing more than a picture they painted because we have been taught to hate. This is not a debate, more of a realization.
Fruitville Station.
Starvation, hungry children across the nation. You know, I'm so sick and tired of living in poverty. Liberty and justice for all. America, why'd you lie?
So no more logging on to social media to express hate. No more social injustice that caused us to separate. No more taking lives that you didn't give. Why let a judge give you life so that you cannot live? No more degrading women. It's time to lift us up. Why endorse hate when we can advertise love?
You know, we can't give up now. We've come too far. I understand, my friends,
because change is hard.
But if hate brings pollution, then I'm calling on a revolution. Let the world open up their eyes, because this time the revolution will be terrorized.